More than any other organ, the brain is sealed off from the outside world and from the rest of the body. There are many layers of tissue, bone, and skin to keep it protected from the outside. But there's also a blood brain barrier that keeps out many substances circulating in the blood. Oxygen and nutrients can cross the blood brain barrier, but many dangerous substances like bacteria cannot. With his skull fractured, Phineas's exposed brain is wide open, making him an ideal candidate for a fatal infection. No one in Cavendish in 1848, no scientist in America or Europe, has the slightest notion that bacteria can cause infection. Medical science in 1848 knows very little about bacteria, even though they were first seen through microscopes nearly 200 years before. Today, we are used to seeing the microscopic world, but when the microscope was invented in the middle of the 17th century, it caused a sensation. The microscope became a new kind of high-tech entertainment for cultured gentlemen, and in 1665, an Englishman named Robert Hooke came up with a microscopic hit. He showed off a slide he made of an extremely thin slice of cork. Under the microscope lens, Hooke saw that the tissue inside a cork tree was made up of rows of tiny, box-like structures. They reminded him of the bare rooms used by monks in a monastery. Hooke called them cells. His cork cells, though, were empty because they were dead and dried out. It would take 2 centuries to figure out that it's the living stuff inside cells that makes them the fundamental unit of life. While Hooke was showing off his cells, a sharp-eyed Dutch merchant named Anton van Leeuwenhoek was making more powerful microscopes. Leeuwenhoek took a single drop of water from a rain barrel and turned his microscope on it. In that drop of water, Leeuwenhoek found a whole new planet of very, very small life forms. Animalcules, he called them. Leeuwenhoek was the first to see single-celled microorganisms, tiny plants, and tiny animals, including bacteria. Yet Leeuwenhoek never had the faintest suspicion that some of his animalcules caused humans to sicken and to die. That's more or less the state of knowledge in 1848. Few doctors have ever used a microscope because it is not considered a medical instrument. These microscopic animals might be marvels of nature, but no doctor suspects they have anything to do with disease, let alone infections. Doctors in 1848 don't use the word infection, but they know its symptoms well. They call it sepsis, and they know from bitter experience how quickly a septic wound can go from slight redness to gross swelling to a fatal condition called gangrene. The doctors of 1848 don't realize that gangrene is the end result of bacterial infection. They don't realize that floating in the air on dust particles, lurking on fingertips, or growing on the shiny steel blades of their unwashed surgical scalpels are single-celled bacteria and other microscopic life forms. On the smallest surface, there are hundreds of millions of them. They represent thousands of different species. There are tiny plants, tiny fungi, tiny viruses, and tiny animals. Among the microanimals are 2 particularly dangerous families of bacteria, Streptococci and Staphylococci, strep and staph for short. What doctors don't know in 1848, strep and staph do: that the broken head of Phineas is an ideal location to land. A wound is an open door. A cut or break in the skin lets staph and strep bacteria colonize the warm, wet, nutrient-rich cells inside. Once these bacteria get established in the body, they reproduce wildly. The body's immune system tries to kill the invading bacteria with an array of special immune cells, while the bacteria try to protect themselves against immune cells by cranking out toxic chemicals. That's an infection. The site of this biological battle between the immune system and bacteria swells up and turns red. In 1848, science is still 20 years away from figuring out that infections are the work of living, that is, biotic, things. It will take nearly a century for scientists to develop the first antibiotic, penicillin, to counter infections. In 1848, a young Frenchman named Louis Pasteur is still studying chemistry in Paris. Eventually, Pasteur will unravel the three great biological mysteries of his time: fermentation, decay, and infection. All three processes are the work of living microorganisms. Pasteur will call them germs. Pasteur's germ theory will lead to a revolution in medicine. It will inspire an English surgeon named Joseph Lister to try performing surgery in sterile conditions that exclude or kill all microorganisms. Lister will scrub his hands almost raw before operating. He will boil surgical clothing and instruments, and he will set up a machine to spray carbolic acid in the operating room to kill germs in midair. Lister's first sterile operations in 1868 will cut the number of deaths from infection after surgery by 90%. For the first time in history, doctors will help more patients with surgery than they harm with post-surgical infections. None of this progress to come will do Phineas a bit of good in 1848. Instead, Phineas is saved by good luck and good care. Dr. Harlow follows the best medical advice of his time. Keep the wound clean but covered and watch for inflammation. A sign of infection is a fluid called pus. It's actually dead white blood cells, a sign that the body's immune system is attacking bacterial invaders, that collects in pockets to form abscesses. 14 days after the accident, Phineas develops a huge abscess under the skin, just above his eyes. Phineas is feverish, losing his appetite and sinking fast. Dr. Harlow lances or punctures the abscess. He drains the pus and dresses Phineas's forehead again. The fever abates. His scalp begins to heal. Phineas is saved by his youth, his iron constitution, and Dr. Harlow's good nursing. Dr. Harlow will always be modest about his role in saving Phineas. I dressed him, Dr. Harlow will say. God healed him. The patient gained strength. Too much strength in his doctor's opinion. Dr. Harlow is called out of town for a few days, and when he comes back, he finds Phineas out of his sickbed. His head still heavily bandaged, Phineas is roaming about Cavendish in the rain with no coat and thin shoes. He is eating unwisely, refusing nursing advice, and ignoring doctor's orders. Phineas says he wants to go home to his mother's house in Lebanon, New Hampshire, 20 miles away. He intends to walk. According to the best medical theories of his day, Dr. Harlow diagnoses an imbalance of bodily humors. This theory, which goes back to the ancient Greeks, declares that health is maintained by a balance of 4 liquids or humors in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To bring them into balance, Dr. Harlow prescribes 2 powerful drugs: an emetic to make Phineas throw up, and a purgative, a powerful laxative to evacuate his bowels. Phineas is knocked flat by the medicines and spends the next 2 weeks in bed, where Dr. Harlow keeps him on a low or bland diet. His humors may or may not be in balance, but Phineas is resting quietly at last. 10 weeks after the accident, Dr. Harlow declares Phineas fully recovered from his wounds. He puts Phineas in a closed carriage and sends him home to his mother in New Hampshire. Phineas is very weak, but he can walk short distances. He can count, feed and dress himself, and sing. He can speak clearly and make sense of what he hears. Yet, there is something odd about the recovered Phineas. Just before he leaves Cavendish, Dr. Harlow gives Phineas a little test. The doctor offers Phineas $1,000 for the pocketful of pebbles that Phineas has collected walking along the Black River near town. Dr. Harlow knows that Phineas can add and subtract, yet Phineas angrily refuses the deal. Dr. Harlow tells himself that a man who was so badly hurt is going to need time to regain his full powers. As soon as Phineas leaves for home, Dr. Harlow writes a short report for the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal. Most doctors ignore Dr. Harlow's article. The few who read it don't believe it. How could a man survive such an injury, let alone make a complete recovery? But one Boston doctor is intrigued. He writes to Harlow for information and urges the Vermont doctor to back up his case by collecting formal statements from eyewitnesses in Cavendish. The letter